Welcome, everyone, to the IMS Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and strategies that you can apply from discussing the research with esteemed leadership experts and practitioners to take your leadership to the next level. My goal is that what we discuss today will be immediately actionable and useful to you, and I'd love to hear comments from this episode of what you're planning on implementing. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Ann Herrmann-Nehdi, who is a thought leader and frequent keynote speaker about leadership and cognitive diversity in today's changing environment. She is the chief thought leader and chairwoman of Herrmann International, which publishes the Herrmann Brain Dominance Instrument, HBDI, based off over 40 years of research on thinking in the brain. The research has been featured in the New York Times, Scientific American, Harvard Business Review, and 9 out of 10 Fortune 200 companies. She is also the best-selling author of the Whole Brain Business Book, which has reached over 500,000 people, along with very popular TED Talks. Welcome to the program, Ann.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So happy you could join me for this episode. Love to get right into what this index really measures. But really, first, I'd like to ask you the question on how does your thinking, how does a leader's thinking drive their effectiveness as a leader? So we can put this into context.
It's interesting for me. It's one of the things that we take for granted, our thinking, because we just do it all day long. But when you stop and reflect upon it, most of what we do as a leader, the problems we solve, the decisions we make, the communications that we decide to engage with, the way we think about those that we lead comes from our brain. And it's so obvious that I think a lot of people overlook it. So looking at your thinking is the best place to start because it's clearly where most of our essence as a leader is emanating from. Who we are as a leader comes from our brain. And it's, for me, very interesting that it's taken us this long. We've been doing this for 40 years to wake up to the fact that our brains have everything to do with managing and leading. So it's more about what is not related to the way we think in terms of how we lead and manage, because almost everything we do is in one way or another related to it.
I agree with you with that. And there's lots of psychometric measurements, tests that we can do. Yours is a very common and famous one. I'd love for you to give a little background on your assessment and really how it differs from some of the other ones that we see, where it's what the Myers-Briggs, the DISC assessment, just to give that context to the leaders listening to say, this is something that's unique and different. It tests something different as well. And here's its value.
Everybody has been through at least one assessment in their career, if not many. And I think it's a reasonable question to sort of say, why would I do another one of those things? I mean, am I just going to learn the same thing about myself? Well, one of the reasons this was actually developed in the first place, and it was developed actually originally at GE. It's part of the management development function at GE. And the reason it got developed, because actually the research behind Myers-Briggs and DISC existed at the time that this was developed, was because it was really trying to eke out that thinking piece of what was happening. How do managers and leaders solve problems? How are they thinking about a given situation? And based on that, what outcome are they going to drive? And so that led to sort of saying, what other science is out there? There's psychology. That's Myers-Briggs type indicator, a lot of other assessments. There's behavior, and there's, DISC is related to situational behavior, a lot of other assessments looking at that. And it was like, but is there something based on the brain and thinking? And that's really what started the assessment development. And it was, interestingly enough, it wasn't designed by somebody who was sort of off there doing research at some university. It was designed in the workplace for the workplace. So it's very, very workplace focused. So when you're looking at it, what we're looking at measuring with the HBDI is our thinking style preference, which may or may not be completely related to our personality or to our behaviors. So there are connections between the two. And if you kind of think about this as a 3-circle model, with you in the center, there are going to be different insights that you get from every one of these assessments. And so what we've often found with ours is that an understanding of your thinking style preferences really actually helps you even better understand maybe what you've learned from a Myers-Briggs or a DISC, because it gives you the context of how your brain may be processing to better understand the results of those assessments. So it's not repetitive. Otherwise, why would I do another assessment if it was giving me the exact same data? But it's really complementary and incredibly helpful. The other thing that I think differentiates it, which I think has a lot to do with the fact that it was born in the workplace, is that it is science-based and it is very practical. So it not only helps you understand your thinking, but it also helps you begin to look at the value of other people's thinking and how that can really feed into a much more innovative outcome, or how you might better collaborate. And especially in today's world with remote and having to try to connect with people you've never met sometimes, really looking at how do I best engage with those that I lead and manage. And understanding their thinking is a really terrific place to start. And you can use the model to go beyond that to diagnose a problem or a situation or your company culture. So it's very, very practical. And so a lot of what I love in my ability to share this with leaders and managers is that you can walk away with some very specific things you can do right away, right, as a result of this.
Great information. And when you talk about thinking preferences, are those preferences your natural preferences, but can they change over time as you're in the workplace? Or is it pretty much set in stone that what you prefer when you're in your 20s, likely you're going to default to those same thinking styles when you're in your 30s, 40s, and beyond?
That's a great question. That's the old nature nurture question, right? And so one of the things that we know is that the brain is what we call plastic. In other words, it's malleable. We don't exist in a vacuum, right? So if you think about yourself at 5 and then at 12 and then at 25 and then at 38, et cetera, you're not exactly the same person, right? And our brains have grown and evolved through our interaction with our environment. So we have some predisposition, right? There's some DNA stuff happening there, right? So we come with a certain predisposition, but then because the brain is malleable by design, we interact with the world, and that does evolve the way we look at the world. And most people can pretty much identify ways that they have had a similar thread throughout the course of their lives and ways that they have seen some significant change. And that might have been through interaction with parents. It could have been through teachers. It could have been that first job. It could have been a really important training experience that they've had. So we find that people's preferences remain pretty consistent starting in their 20s, right, over time, except when there has been a major life change. And what's really interesting is that we have found that the pandemic has been a significant changing factor for many people. We've seen more people's preferences change as a result of the pandemic than in any other time that I have been working with this research. And I think it's because collectively, there was such a big impact on people's values and their lives and their thinking about what do I want to be and where do I want to focus the rest of my life and all of those factors. And then so many dramatic changes to just the way we lived our lives. That actually has had more of an impact. So I've seen more profiles change as a result of the pandemic than practically any other era. Otherwise, it's been pretty much an individual situation.
That's good to know, because that would then remind leaders to say that even though they've taken it maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it might be worth taking again because of this significant impact of the pandemic and everything else that's happened in the last 2 years has affected people with. So I agree with you. The thinking styles is so important, and to know your preferences, but to differentiate between your natural preferences versus your competencies, right? Because those two
Absolutely.
things are different. So could you just unpack that a little bit?
Absolutely. I mean, it's easy for people when you talk about brain to immediately kind of make a leap to competencies. And in fact, what we're looking at here is preferences about what kind of gets us to leap out of bed in the morning when we're excited about something. It's the kinds of activities and mental processes that really engage our brains. Not necessarily the easiest, often the most engaging, rewarding, interesting. Now, we all have things that we have to learn and competencies we have to develop that are not in that sweet spot of our preference, that we maybe procrastinate around, and it takes a tremendous amount of energy to do. So what we've found is that people tend to develop many of their competencies in areas of great preference, but we all have competencies in areas of lesser preference because that's what the world actually requires from us. And what's really important to know is, okay, irrespective of what your preferences are, what does the situation require? And do I have a competency gap in that particular situation? And so if that's an area of low preference for me, that's going to take a little more energy for me. And I'm going to maybe be a little less motivated to develop that skill. So what's it going to take for me to actually become more effective and develop greater skills there. And understanding your preferences really can help you navigate that and also help explain maybe why you've avoided doing some of that work over the course, even if you've gotten feedback over the course of your career. I was working with a leader not too long ago who said to me, I've always kind of known this. And I've gotten feedback, like my 360 feedback and others. I've gotten feedback from other leaders about the fact that I actually really need to develop greater empathy when I'm interacting with those that I lead. But frankly, it just is so uncomfortable for me to do it. And it takes so much energy that I just have kind of avoided it. And then the pandemic hit, and I was really in a bad place because I had to be there for my team and they were expecting empathy. And I was kind of like, what do I do? And so I think part of what this is about is building that self awareness and having a nice, clean model that allows you to get clear. What are my preferences? What does the situation require? How do I either stretch beyond my natural preferences to respond to the situation? And maybe what skills gaps might I have that I need to actually develop or partner with others to help provide a response that's most effective for the situation at hand?
That's great that it can inform those areas as well, your thinking styles, because that's so important to help leaders out. Because you're right, competencies are completely different. And you do have to develop competencies in areas that you naturally don't want to or don't prefer. But this will help you in that regard as well. Let's dive a little bit deeper into the model, just kind of maybe giving a high level overview of those four quadrants, just for our listeners, just so they can be aware of really what the four quadrants of the brain that this test covers.
Okay. I'll just say I don't like to call it a test because the test implies right and wrong, and there's no right or wrong associated with this. And everybody, one of the things that differentiates us on a few pieces of information of context is that this is not an either or construct. So you have some degree of preference for each of these four quadrants. So it's not like you're a this or a that. It's a question of to what degree do I have preference for this particular area? The other thing that we do is we look at your day-to-day preference and we also look at what happens to you under pressure. So you actually get two profiles as part of this. So you might be thinking as I'm describing this about, okay, my day-to-day self and my under pressure self, because there's really those two elements. For some people, it's the same, but for many people, there's a bit of a shift under pressure. So the first quadrant that is, I think many of you will relate to is what we call that analytical quadrant. And it is all about understanding performance and goals and metrics and technology and logic and breaking things down and solving problems. And lots of times you'll find occupations like engineering or technology occupations associated with this. And in many situations, the primary question for this quadrant is what? What is the problem? What is the goal? What do I need to know? I don't need to know more than what I need to know. Just give me the bottom line, right? And so for some people, this is kind of where they like to live. The first thing is, what's the ROI? What am I going to get out of this? And for others, if you don't like this kind of thinking, that makes you sort of cringe when somebody asks that question of you. And you think, oh God, I don't even know the answer to that question. Another quadrant adjacent to this particular quadrant is the practical quadrant. And this is all about looking at details and organization and process and making things happen. Strong bias for action, strong bias for getting a plan put in place. This particular quadrant often sees occupations that have to do with project management, all different kinds of management situations, although managers are often required to do other things these days. Those that are actually into logistics and making things happen in execution, quality control, et cetera. And the key question for this particular quadrant is how? How am I going to do this? How are we going to, get something out of that great idea that you just told me about that sounded really interesting, but I just don't see how we can execute against it. And this particular quadrant is really, really good at taking any given situation and starting from the beginning and building a plan going forward. If you're not comfortable with this particular quadrant, somebody asking you for a ton of details and what's the plan, again, might make you shudder. It's kind of like, wait a minute. I mean, like, let's just stay with the big picture for the time being. I don't have all those details figured out yet. And it might take a lot of energy for you to do that. Another quadrant is the people quadrant, and it's all about looking at how we emote, engage, express ourselves, communicate how we're feeling and being in touch with those feelings, but also how we might express ourselves through things like writing as well. So for somebody who's more on the introverted scale, they might be expressing themselves in other forms. So it's not necessarily somebody who's talking all the time, although expression is a big piece of this quadrant. And you'll see occupations that have to do with teaching and training and development and service and taking care of customers, taking care of others, and all different kinds of support, occupations. And the key question, of course, for this quadrant is who? Who is going to be impacted? Who do I need to be taking care of? Who is here that might need to know something from me? And so if you are not comfortable with this particular quadrant, that whole, just like the person I described earlier, having to get into that empathy and sort of stepping into those perhaps more personal conversations might make you really uncomfortable. And then finally, the last quadrant, and there are four of these, is the possibilities quadrant. It's the experimental, big picture, conceptual, often global, sometimes creative way of looking at the world. Very, very good at generating a whole lot of ideas, looking out into the future with great comforts, thinking out 2, 3, 4 years, feeling very excited about the possibilities of something that might be new and different. And of course, the question for this quadrant is why? And so you'll see lots of occupations that have to do with invention, with looking at new kinds of thinking. Entrepreneurs typically have got a lot of this kind of thinking. Strategic planners have got this kind of thinking. People doing brand work, looking at different strategic aspects of marketing. And many executives often bring this because of the strategy work that they need to do and the ability to see the big picture. So if you're not comfortable with this, the idea of doing a whole lot of things that have never been tested before might make you very uncomfortable. So we all have some degree of preference against each of these four quadrants. Most of us actually have two primary preferences or three. Less than 3% of the population has got all four. So most of us are some combination of those four. And of course, when you put them together, it shows up a little bit differently than the sort of independent descriptors I gave you just a moment ago. But that helps kind of clarify each of the quadrants sort of stands for.
I love that description. Thank you for providing that overview with those four quadrants. And I've taken it before. I'm planning on taking it again. And I love
Great.
how it also gives you a preference for your natural tendencies as well as under pressure. Because at least for me, when I did it, the preference really pushed hard in two areas to when I was under pressure. Do you find that quite common, I assume, for a lot of the profiles? Or so the two strongest profiles for me were A and B, the blue and the green quadrant.
Analytical and practical, right?
And I really went even more so in that direction under pressure. Is that common, or do you see a lot of people doing the profile or leaders going to different preferred thinking styles when they're under pressure?
So it's a little difficult to generalize, but for many people under pressure, they will actually index even further into an area. Not always both. We found that, for example, if you have analytical and practical, as you described, that the blue and green, if you use the colors in our model, some might find themselves under pressure going more strongly into a safekeeping, practical planning mode under pressure because they feel the need to get into control under pressure, right? If somebody has got a strong preference towards emotion and people, they might find that the pressure actually revs that up even more. And in some instances, however, if you've got several strong preferences, the under pressure profile might actually kind of be a tiebreaker, right? And so you might find that one or two of those actually sort of breaks through under pressure. And it's kind of like when push comes to shove, I am definitely going to be moving in this particular direction. What I found is that one of the reasons this is so helpful, especially now with the pandemic, and we did some research recently looking at resilience. And what we found is that people having gone through the first year and a half of the pandemic who had done their profile, 60% said that they were living in their under pressure profile. In other words, their normal day-to-day profile was kind of pushed to the side because their lives were so under pressure that they found themselves living in more of that extreme state and feeling less mentally agile because of it. So I think that it's really useful to understand for a few reasons. First and foremost, you may feel it's perfectly natural for your thinking to shift under pressure. However, somebody you work with may think, whoa, wait a minute, where did that come from? Suddenly there's this really strong need to have data and facts and a plan when usually, usually Charles is not quite so intensely needing that, but I could tell something's going on with him, right? So when you're working with a team, when they understand what happens under pressure, so my profile, I go more blue under pressure, which is more that analytical processing. And I lose a little bit of that people stuff, which I have in my profile, but not as strongly. And I had an assistant some years ago who, knowing this information, the first thing she did in our one-on-ones is she would check in to see if I was under pressure or not. And if she felt like I was really under pressure and I was going to be really focused on just the facts, she would completely change the structure of our one-on-one, because she was like, I'm not going to do any chit chat with Ann. I'm not going to do that whole thing. Like, how was your weekend or whatever? I'm just going to go down to the bottom line, etc. So it made her feel a little more comfortable, and it gave her some clues as to how to best work with me in that situation. So that can be very useful both for you and those that you work with, and to understand and help them understand that it's maybe not about them. It's really about you, and that your thinking may be shifting based on the situation at hand. Now, for people who don't see a shift, and we have about 10% of the population where their profile really doesn't shift much under pressure, the challenge for them is that people don't know that they're under pressure, and they seem like what you see is what you get. And others may not know, wow, this person's really feeling the heat because it's not showing up as much in a shift. So there's kind of pluses and minuses to both sides.
Great information to know. And I know that with me, it's blue, red, and green. It's kind of all three of those are pretty high, but I really go and gravitate more into that blue and green area, which makes sense during pressure. And I completely agree with you that it's so valuable to have that and to share that with your team so they know how to deal with you when there's a pressure situation, right? Like what you were saying, let's just cut the chit chat and just get to the facts. Tell me what we need, get to the bottom line, shorten the story. So effective in helping with that interpersonal communication, especially in a day and age where people are struggling with that because with the hybrid teams, with the remote workforce, and having a insight from a test that brings that to everyone is really valuable.
And what I found, especially in this remote hybrid environment, is that because we weren't seeing each other face to face as much, many leaders and managers were struggling because they couldn't really always tell what was going on with their team. And so one of the reasons they found this to be so useful is it gave them a language around which to sort of say, I'm sensing that you're really in that high practical mode today. So it's like something going on for you, like talk to me a little bit about what's happening. So without having to feel like you're breaching some personal kind of a situation, having that language around which to talk about what's going on was a real godsend, because, you don't know people as well. And we know that, many people still haven't met people that they got hired during the pandemic. So when you don't know somebody so well, but you're sensing over Zoom, maybe that something's going on, it's sometimes hard to have that conversation. So understanding what somebody's preferences are and where they go under pressure can accelerate your ability to engage differently and get to know them better and be able to sense that maybe they actually need your help and support as a leader when you might not normally know that.
You're right. Today, it's more important now than ever to have that kind of information handy because you're not getting those indications from people live and in person anymore. And it's much harder to read them. And if you know that preference, so valuable. Now, you state there's no ideal preference with this index, so that there's not someone saying, okay, if I'm all four quadrants, I'm better than someone that's just one or two quadrants. But I would like to push on you a little bit about those that are executives or CEOs. What have you found? Any patterns with those individuals with this index?
So, yeah. So before I answer that question, I want to do a disclaimer, which is that so people do often assume if I'm balanced across all four, that's like nirvana, right? And we do see some trends with CEOs and senior executives where there's a lot of balance. Let me just speak to that balance piece. What success really is when your preferences are uniquely aligned with the work that you're doing, right? And so, and especially since we know that you can shift, you can think of your preferences kind of like a rubber band, then it's really more about how are you leveraging the thinking that you bring to the table to get the greatest success, and how agile are you in your thinking to adapt to a situation that may be beyond your preference. So we have seen that more frequently with senior execs and CEOs in particular, you will see a pretty balanced profile, at least three strong primaries, if not all four. And when you sit back and you think about that, and having been a CEO myself for many years, the work requires it. When you're in a senior executive position, you are having to look at the big picture and think strategy and understand the dynamics both inside and outside your organization. You have to understand the business, the numbers, the goals, the performance. And if you're in a technical business, some of the technology that's related to that. You've got to be able to get stuff done and make sure that stuff is getting done in your organization. And you have to be able to engage not only your team, but the rest of the organization and understand your customer. So all 4 quadrants are really required. And typically, as a CEO, your team represents all the different functions that represent all of those quadrants. So the most effective CEOs that I know tend to either be pretty balanced in their preferences, or they are situationally very adept at recognizing where they naturally go. And then they make sure that they compensate for those areas that are not quite as natural for them. And often will surround themselves with 1 or 2 key people who tend to be that voice for them to remind them, let's make sure we're not overlooking this, right? So yes, you will see very strong multi-dominant profiles for many CEOs. And especially as you look at, for example, entrepreneurs, what makes them really successful as an entrepreneur. And it's maybe that ability to really push out risk and see out into the future and push for development at lightning speed to get to the market. That once the company has then grown into another state, that may not serve them quite as well as it did when they were an entrepreneur. So they have to find ways to surround themselves with people and then listen to those folks so that they can function in a whole brain way, right? So it's great to have those preferences. The downside, however, of having very balanced preferences is that you tend to want to see things from all 4 perspectives all the time. So that sometimes slows down your decision making. You kind of think, well, let me understand this. What are the facts? Do I have all the facts? And, oh, well, wait a minute. I don't know. I kind of want to look at other possibilities here because I think there may be some more ideas. Well, let me talk to a few people and find out what they think. Well, I don't know. I'd like to think about what our timeline is for this. And that need to be able to look at all 4, which is great, can actually take a little bit more time. So for some people who work with somebody, if you work with somebody who's constantly doing that and asking you again, another question and another question and another question, what might be going on for them is not that they don't necessarily have confidence in you. It may be that they just need more data than others in terms of making a decision. So they'll be asking you the what question, the how question, the who question, and the why question. And as a matter of fact, I often encourage leaders to do just that. Make sure you're asking all 4 of those questions, or else you might get blindsided by a situation. So if you've got somebody who's leading you, who's doing that, they may actually be using a whole brain approach. And so keep that in mind. And if you prepare answers to all 4 of those questions before you go meet with them, they'll be pleasantly surprised and probably pretty happy.
That's great. I love how each quadrant has that question. And if you ask that question, you're hitting on those 4 quadrants and you're going to be more effective as a leader as a result. Love to just unpack a little bit more about the whole brain teams because what you just kind of alluded to was that they are more effective than homogeneous teams, that you want people that are different from you, that have different preferences, because that adds cognitive diversity to your team. Can you give us more understanding around that? And I assume you agree that a whole brain approach in a team is much better than having people that think and act the same way.
Sure. Well, it's the notion of cognitive diversity is one that we've been talking about for many years. And in recent years, the notion of bringing together diverse thinkers of any nature, looking at gender and race, et cetera, has already demonstrated that you get significantly more creative and innovative ideas and better results. We've known from our research that if you're looking at the lens of cognitive diversity, whole brain teams can be up to 6% more effective than non-whole brain teams. Why? Why is that? Well, and there are some caveats to make it work. When you look at it, if you've got a very specific task at hand that is only requiring a certain kind of thinking, well, yeah, sure, maybe a homogeneous team will get you there faster because you all agree. You kind of like, hey, you gave us 3 hours, it took us 10 minutes, we're good. But when you've got any kind of complexity of a situation, and most of the challenges that we have in the workplace today are pretty complex, with a lot of change happening around, is you need to have different perspectives to be able to get to the best possible solution. So what we have found is that when you have a team of differences, what's really required to get to that level of effectiveness is first and foremost, know that there are differences and that there's value to those different perspectives. So if you're getting annoyed by somebody asking you the why question every time, you're not going to pay attention to that. You're not going to get the value out of that. So if you're a leader, you've got a person who's bringing that big possibility thinking, and you sort of say, why are they always asking why? And gee, I thought we'd had this done, and they keep asking more questions. Well, you might say to yourself, well, maybe there's a possibility that this person might be able to uncover that could give us a better solution than the one that we've been doing before. So each quadrant brings a different level of value. And when you bring them all four together, you get completely new thinking, which is going to be so much better than any one of the individual quadrants by themselves. So it's clearly more than the sum of the parts. And we know this from all of our years of research, but it's not necessarily the easiest route. So some people will say, well, gee, that's nice, Ann, but does it take longer? Well, yeah, it might take a little bit longer because you've got to make sure everybody has a voice, and you've got to have a process around which to understand what the situation requires, what kind of thinking is required, and then how to best come to a solution. However, one of the things that I think is a big advantage of whole brain thinking is that we've got great tools to help you do that as a team. So one of the biggest applications of this work has been in teams from the very beginning. And though even as a leader or a manager, you're going to get tremendous individual insight, the biggest bang, in my view, then comes when you then expand this to look at your team and understand that dynamic. And you might find, hey, we've got this big gaping hole in our cognitive diversity. And that's why, gosh, when we did that last postmortem of that project, we realized our execution just really wasn't there. Maybe we need that kind of thinking, and we need to bring that to bear. So we're very excited because we've just launched a new integration into Microsoft Teams that allows you to pull your HBDI team data right in to Microsoft Teams as an app. And because we've had so many teams say to us, we want it right here in front of us so that we can use it every day. So Teams is a very big and important application because so much of what we do today is in Teams.
I agree with you completely and love that insight into that cognitive diversity and how important it is, because there's a lot of talk about diversity right now, right? And I think the cognitive piece of it is not necessarily at the forefront, which it really should be, and it earns its own keep in many ways, and many teams are starting to see that as well. So as we're ending this episode, love to give a call to action to our listeners or to those leaders that are listening to see, is there one tool or tip that you can share on how to build whole brain teams or just improving your thinking style or preference?
So I have a simple phrase that is a big recommendation above and beyond the four questions I just mentioned, the what, how, who, and why, which is a very simple tool that anybody can use. And that phrase is stop and think. So often in today's world, we are running nonstop, from back to back meetings, starting first thing in the morning, all the way to the end of the day. It's a complete blur in our brains, right? And so it's very difficult to get the best yield from your thinking if you don't stop and think, what does this situation require? What kind of thinking does the situation require? What kind of thinking is this team member looking from me? What kind of thinking am I maybe getting lost in and needing to kind of pull back from? So having a stop and think moment, especially when you're with your team and you're stuck, and just calling that time out to say, hey, wait a minute, wait. We're just going and going and going and going. We're spinning, we're swirling. Let's just take a moment to have a stop and think moment. And if you have a model like the whole brain model, you could very quickly go and say, where are we stuck? What's going on here? And in a non-judgmental way, you can very quickly diagnose, oh gosh, we're clearly stuck over here. We're missing this kind of thinking. But just that simple moment of taking a stop and think moment, book your call for 50 minutes instead of 60, and use that extra 10 minutes, or if it whittles down to 5, to just stop and think and say, what happened here? What was required? What do I need to be doing? And if you could just get that into your daily ritual, you will find that since attention is the new currency, our attention is all over the place. You just have to pull it back in and give your brain a chance to help you better solve the problems you're facing.
Love that advice. Thank you so much for joining me today, Ann. Had a great conversation with you, and I think we shared lots of valuable advice for our leaders that are listening today to the podcast.
Thank you. It was great to have this conversation. I'm looking so forward to the session.
Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you, and also remind them of the differences between the book and the app or the assessment, so they know if they should take one or the other, or if they just complement one another.
Sure. So the assessment is kind of the core piece that allows you to understand your personal thinking preference, and it gives you an opportunity to personalize your data as well as share with others on your team. So we've got a whole platform. So that's really kind of the core piece. The book is all about how do you apply this in your organization. And the app is a complement to the actual HBDI assessment. It allows you to think about where other people might be, to have it kind of available to you on the fly. And I could be reached. Our website is thinkherrmann.com, and Herrmann is with 2 R's and 2 N's. So it's Herrmann. And you can find me on LinkedIn under Ann Herrmann with that same spelling. And I'm also on Twitter and Instagram as well. So you can find me that. But Think Herrmann is the best place to go. And it's Think, ThinkHerrmann.com.
Thank you, Ann, again for joining me today. Wonderful conversation with you. And this concludes this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. If you like this episode and want to subscribe, this podcast can be found both on Apple and Spotify, and can also be accessed on the Institute for Management Studies website at ims-online.com. And until next time, remember, it's not what you know that makes a difference, but what you do consistently.